Our wonderful speaker today, Robin, was a journalist for many years, working for several different newspapers, and the last one was the Santa Cruz Sentinel. And so she's known Bruce McPherson a long time and the other staff members there a long time. And then she had the unique opportunity of covering the Board of Supervisors and then going to work for one of the supervisors and being on the other side of the coin. And that's always very, very interesting. And we see that sometimes when we have people that have been staff members and that run for a public office, and then they can see the other side of it, what it's really like to be on that side making the decisions and having to balance everything and try to make good, fair decisions. So she was there for Ellen's 12 years, and as you remember, there were lots of interesting topics during those 12 years. And Ellen served those three terms and did a wonderful job, and then decided to join the Peace Corps with her husband and do something else. And so Robin was scooped up by newly elected Supervisor Bruce McPherson. And since she lives in the Valley, it was a perfect fit because she knows the issues up here and she knows people up here. And so that's just wonderful. So I'd like to have you talk about your thoughts about being a journalist. How did your writings influence the public, do you think, and how your work for the supervisors has made a difference? And right now, the Volunteer Center of Santa Cruz is accepting nominations for Be the Difference, or Make the Difference, or Be the Difference. And that is certainly Robin Musitelli, who's made such a difference in this community for so long. We haven't heard very much about it sometimes, but that's why we're having her today, to hear all about it. So Robin, welcome.
There we go. Careful. Okay, I'm all tangled up already. Thank you, League of Women Voters, for having me, and thank you, Valley Women's Club. I consider both organizations really wonderful public service organizations, and I'm very proud to have been on the board and the president of the Valley Women's Club at one point. I also would like to introduce my newest and youngest granddaughter, who I just see sneaked in the back. Her name is Felicity Faye Durand-Dejay, and that's my lovely daughter, Angela. I feel very, very fortunate to have had two really great careers, one in journalism and the next in county government, which I consider public service as well. I'm an apple that didn't fall very far from the tree. I was born into a journalism family. My parents had bought a small newspaper in Lander, Wyoming, which is on the Wind River Reservation, and then they started a half a dozen more. And so, as you all know, newspapers are a lot of work, and there were always plenty of jobs to go around for the kids. My father made sure of it. And one of my jobs was to stuff the newspapers into envelopes for the out-of-town subscribers. Another one, I was always dispatched, for the missed newspapers, and I would usually try to ride my horse to deliver the papers. I had my own little Pony Express at the time. And then I also occasionally ran the press, and I didn't run the press, but I sat up on top of our big flatbed press and would feed the newspaper print sheet at a time into this press. So my father ran the news side of the business. He was it. He was the photographer, the editor, the writer, the editor, the publisher, everything. My mother sold the advertising. She did the proofreading from big bins of linotype, which all the newspapers were cast in metal. And so she would proofread these bins upside down and backwards. And so our newspaper had... Say what? Say what? Oh, no, go ahead.
It sounds like Ginger Rogers.
It's exactly, and she wore 3-inch heels. We had lots of correspondents and columnists in hunting and fishing and history and that sort of thing. We had rural correspondents that told the news of some of the outposts. All the Wyoming towns are outposts. The only competition we had in town was the radio station that we called the Rip and Read Radio, because they would just take our newspaper and rip the articles out and read the stories for their newscast. The only newscaster that we knew was Walter Cronkite. And he didn't come to Wyoming and report from the Wind River Reservation very often. So the most important story that our newspaper broke was in the late 50s, early 60s. And this was the killing of hundreds of eagles, bald eagles and golden eagles. A rancher, who was also my 5th grade science teacher, and his wife was my 4-H teacher, came to the Journal one day and said, you know, he had this observation that hundreds of eagles were being poisoned and shot. And he teamed up with my father, and they reported this story. At the time, bald eagles were protected under federal law, but there was no protection for golden eagles. So they reported it, and eventually the federal law got changed to include protections for golden eagles. And the other reporter in this, my 5th grade science teacher, was Tom Bell, who went on to found High Country News, which was the first and probably still the most respected environmental publication being printed today. And that's where he got his start. The eagle killings stopped. From that time on, I knew I was going to be a journalist. I wanted to be a journalist so badly, almost as much as I wanted to be a rodeo queen. It's another story. Like all community newspapers, the Journal reflected the practical and mundane concerns of everyday life. Who won ribbons at the county fair, who was born, who died, who was engaged, who got married. And woe be to the country editor who forgot to include every last detail of the bride's wedding. The school lunches were printed, and so was the menu of the lunch at the White House when my father went to the White House with other editors of rural publications to meet with President Kennedy. Can you believe that? A president actually invited editors. They were respected at that time. They were sought out for their views. They knew the community and they knew the issue, and President Kennedy appreciated that. Of course, my father reported it in complete detail, with including everything that Jackie Kennedy at that time wore. It's true that community newspapers, the tenet of community newspapers are the small things. It's the small things in life. But this is one of the truths of community journalism that is different than the metropolitan and larger dailies. They are people-oriented and site-specific, location-specific, I should say. I won't go into too many details, but I had a rough time in school on the reservation. I was in and out of high school before managing to graduate, and then I headed to college in California, San Jose State University, where one of my first classes was with Jessica Mitford. I don't know if you're familiar with Jessica Mitford, but she was a great muckraker from England originally. And she had just written a big expose on the funeral industry. And then she created her own controversy at San Jose State when she refused to be fingerprinted. So we had our own little, protest to cover. We could be in the protest and cover it. The curriculum at San Jose State was politics, local politics and state politics, gathering information, the First Amendment, and what was then a brand new body of law, privacy laws, and of course writing and editing. Nowadays, a San Jose State journalism student can get a 100% degree in online journalism with courses in digital production, multimedia storytelling, digital content, and digital management, along with courses in writing, editing, and of course, journalism ethics. As far as I know, journalists are the only ones who are trained in how local government works. And this is important. Even public policy majors are taught how federal and state laws are made and how those governments work, but they aren't trained in how local government works. In my senior year, Bob Woodward, came to campus, and the journalism students were invited to go out for beer and pizza with him. This was in 1974, months before President Nixon resigned. And of course, that visit had a huge influence on my commitment to journalism, and whether it paid or didn't pay, which it doesn't. Degree in hand, I returned to Wyoming. I was ready to report. So I went to work for one of my father's competitors, a daily in Cheyenne. And I was covering the state legislature. Well, let me tell you a story from those days. First, the great drinking and driving debate. This was 1975 in Wyoming. There were laws against drunk driving, but there were no laws against drinking and driving. So the Wyoming legislature was asked to consider a bill, that would ban drinking and driving. Well, it was a heck of a dust-up. The biggest hurdle was the stunning news to the lawmakers that they couldn't measure the distance or the time in how many beers they drank. As in, it's a 2-beer drive to Laramie. You mean to tell me I can't have a few beers on the way to hunting camp? It's a 3-beer drive, Well, the legislation didn't pass that year. It was several more years before it passed. And I think it was prodded a little bit by the federal government, who had some control over the road funding. I stumbled into the next story completely unwittingly. I was asked by the publisher to put together a list of the most influential, most important sources on my beat. Well, since I was covering the Capitol, I listed the Secretary of State, the State Superintendent of Schools, the governor, legislators, folks like that. And these people were going to be invited to take a train from Laramie to Cheyenne, which is about 50 miles. And it was a big party. It was a big drunken party. And then they would go see the Wyoming football game and then return. Well, the publisher thought my list was absolutely hilarious. Except it was funny, but I didn't know why. And then he explained to me, well, Robin, you've included women on your list. Oh, yeah. Oh. And this was the equality state. This was the first state to grant women the right to vote. It was a state that had been settled. The frontier had been settled by women, with and without men. It had been, and it was a profession where women had, stood byline to byline with men for ever since the beginning. I was absolutely shocked. I was mad. I was hurt. I was heartbroken, actually. And that was the end of I made a little fuss. And that was the end of the Treagle train, this train tradition. And it was the end of me in Wyoming. I returned to California, packed up, came back to California, and immediately went to work for the Valley Press, Scotts Valley Banner. And I have to tell you the rest of the story. So Wyoming was the first state to grant women the right to vote. But this is because they needed a population threshold to move from a territory to a state. And the question was whether they granted women or Indians the right to vote. And, well, they thought they could control the women's vote better than they could control the Native Americans' vote. So, in California, I worked at the Valley Press, Scotts Valley Banner, San Jose Mercury, and the Sentinel. And even though the Mercury is a larger circulation paper, at that time they had many local editions, including the Santa Cruz section that I wrote for. And this was a time when the Valley Press was a broadsheet newspaper instead of a tab, and it typically ran 24 to 36 pages. It was, and the Sentinel did too. We had a lot of news hole to fill, and we didn't have the, AP Press or anything else to fill it with. So, at the community newspapers, reporters learned really quickly the importance of accountability and honesty. When I first got there, I accidentally translated my notes, BC, and I wrote Boulder Club instead of the Brookdale Club. Well, the difference is the Boulder Club was a roughneck bar in Boulder Creek, and the Brookdale Club was a Brookdale tea, ladies' tea, and book club. Oops, 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 oops. Oops. Readers do care very deeply about what town newspapers say about them. It's their newspaper, and it gives them a voice. Readers trust their hometown newspaper above all other news sources. Fake news, I don't even think it's possible. I don't think you could put fake news in a local newspaper without getting called out on it. The larger media rely on the local news. They're constantly scanning the smaller newspaper for stories that they can pick up. And in Santa Cruz, as you know, it's usually, you know, on the side of the weird. They love those stories. I want to touch on a concept of truth that I think is different at community newspapers than the larger newspapers. And that's the difference between the whole truth versus the considered truth. Say, for instance, a woman has been arrested for drunk driving. The newspaper has the right to print her name, her address, everything that is on the arrest report. Do you do it? Who would benefit? Who would be hurt? And I think that community journalists are more likely to make a judgment call based on what is best for the community than what is best to sell newspapers. That's another key difference. And of course, you know, besides a small town paper that printed every detail wouldn't last long, because they are businesses. And these are, you know, the same people that we are our coaches, teachers, 4-H leaders, and whose parents are the, you know, parents whose kids are the friends of our kids. You have to use a judgment that errs in kindness rather than disclosing all. Community newspapers are based on relationships. Social media has given them great tools for that, finding people to interview, helping them with research, interacting with readers, and also covering live events. No matter how techy, however, the truth remains that community reporters understand their community. They give readers a voice, and they help build community relationships. And I don't mean to imply that they're perfect. They're probably not. You know, some community newspapers are prone to boosterism rather than real news. Real noise. And they don't invest in their reporting staff like they should. You know, small papers are considered to be training grounds for the big newspapers, and they don't give the reporters any sort of long-term investment to be there. There's a 2-time Pulitzer-winning reporter that used to work at the Sentinel who asked for a raise and was told, no, this is a training ground, and she was let go. She went on to join the AP, and Martha Mendoza now has 2 Pulitzers under her belt, but she started at the Sentinel. However, community journalism has had a resurgence. Lion, which is the local independent online news organization, has funded hundreds of new online local sites. They've taken root because they had a business model, unlike the previous versions of online newspapers that had no business model, and they couldn't sustain themselves. Some of them are online only, some of them are print and online, some of them are nonprofit, some of them are for-profit, but the local advertisers have responded. They still want to be associated with quality local journalism. These small newspapers and online sites, I should say, are the fastest growing and promising of the whole emerging local news ecosystem that includes public radio, citizen journalism, online weeklies, student media, and of course community newspapers. They are often backpack journalists, I call them. They carry the whole means of production in their backpack. They do the editorial content now, the audio, the visual, they own their own media, and they produce their own publications. Many of them are correspondents for larger media, but nevertheless, they are independent journalist voices who work for themselves and own their own work. Finally, we are beginning to value the community journalists in a way that we haven't seen for a long, long time. The new local sites are also breaking out of chain ownership, which I credit as the most destructive force in the decline of newspapers. Not because they are conspiracy-minded or that they all print the same, you know, someone tells them what to print and they have a shared viewpoint, but simply because they're saddled with debt. As the chains buy these newspapers, they are encumbered with so much debt that it doesn't matter if they were printing money instead of news. They could not become as profitable as the chains want them to be. Our local newspapers have never been unprofitable. They've never, am I correct, John D? On that? I don't think they've ever lost money. I think they just simply could not make as much money as they as they are expected to, as they need to pay off this debt. Another example, well, also, because of this new layer of online journalism, we have what we call the engaged journalists, who are able to report the news and also engage in creating these collaborative solutions online with their readers. They have become this thread that holds the whole fabric of the community together, or helps do that. And another example of this is what are called blockchain media. It's the podcasts, better known as podcasts. And these are citizen journalists who can own their own work as well. Hundreds of them have been given seed grants from a group called Civic. And what it does is promote this very ground-fed brand journalism, which in turn feeds our democracy. Whether these are who is the gatekeeper of these broadcasts, whether they're junk or real food, I don't know, but that's still sorting itself out. So far, they seem to be very, very high quality and real news. So grab on or log on to a local newspaper and breathe in the authenticity of homegrown news that would be overlooked by larger media. Cherish them. I'm going to switch tracks here and talk about my life in government. In 2001, I realized I was no longer having fun. The newspaper where I worked was losing readers and in turn blaming reporters. We were told to write longer stories, then shorter stories, then more stories, as the newspaper grasped for a winning formula. I left, and I went to work as an analyst for the newly elected Supervisor Ellen Peary in the 2nd District. And 12 years later, for Supervisor Bruce McPherson, my former editor in the 5th District. I found many, many similarities with being a journalist. I worked on the same issues with the same people, but with a different perspective. I often describe the work as community social worker. Much of it was constituent work. That included everything, but it was mostly helping get people to the right places to get the answers that they needed and make sure those answers worked for them. As a former journalist, I had an advantage. I knew the county government, how it worked, where to probe, who to ask, and how to make changes in the system. I knew how to untangle complex issues, and as a county analyst, I had the added advantage of being able to resolve issues, not just highlight the problems. And I'll tell you, neighborhood disputes are the toughest. A neighbor who has a junked property next to you, and there's virtually nothing that can be done. A neighbor who's squawking parrots were in the backyard next to you. Again, nothing can be done. Neighbors who cut firewood with a chainsaw all weekend long. Good neighbors are important in life, and you learn that very quickly too. But in moving from the 2nd District to the 5th District, I only moved down the hall. But oh, she's waving at me. Excuse me. But there are really big differences in the 2 districts. The Aptos District, the 2nd District, residents want and they expect their government to work on their behalf. They expect answers and action on everything from alligator cracks in their pavement to politics on vacation rentals or policies. In the 5th District, it's a more of a live and let live attitude where government isn't welcome unless invited. In the 5th District, I received an anonymous call from a woman who was concerned when the third illegal house, was being built on her road. The third house with no electricity, no sewer system, no water. But still, she didn't want to get those folks in trouble. Big difference between the mountain folks, and the coastal folks, as I call them. In the 2nd District, I got to work on the Aptos Village Plan for many, many years. Over the years, there had been a lot of attempts to develop the Aptos Village, which was in the town plan, but they had all failed. And the reason they had failed is that there were 5 property owners, big property owners of the land that needed to be developed, and they were all landlocked. So Supervisor Peary realized this, and she set out to reconfigure, get all the developers or property owners together and reconfigure the lots, which took a lot because each lot had to be rather the same or comparable in size to what it was previously, but it also had to have certain development rights. Everybody wanted to develop their property to the potential that they could. Well, that took years and years of negotiation. And then we held dozens of community meetings regarding the design and the development plans so the community could get what they wanted in there: a skate park, a community meeting center, or a community common green as we called it. I think the new result is fantastic, absolutely fantastic. We have saved the historic Aptos barn and enhanced it, so it's going to be an organic grocery store. The village is going to be completely walkable. It is going to be oriented for, many of the townhouses are sized for seniors. It's going to have the mix of architecture is interesting. I think it's going to be a very, very good success, development success for Aptos. Where am I? Felton Library, my favorite, one of my favorites. So there was a groundbreaking yesterday, which was awesome. When Supervisor McPherson took office, that project had stalled. The property owners wanted to donate the land at a discounted price with certain conditions, and that's where the project was stuck. The family members who owned the land weren't in agreement. Bruce convened one of those, everybody in the same room at the same time and locked the door meetings. They work. This time, both husbands and wives were at the table, as well as Susan Moriello, the former CAO, and Nancy Gert of Friends of the Felton Library. We had done a few rounds around the table, and it looked like we were getting stuck again with, the family just was not in agreement. And then their wives stepped in, and there was a price on the table, and they said, deal. Yeah, and then Nancy Gert stepped in. They said, well, we have this other half acre for sale. What are we going to do with that? And Nancy said, we'll buy it. Friends of the Library. And that is after 10 years of negotiations and discussions. The women came to the table, and the deal was done that afternoon. Yes. Yes. While working for Supervisor Peary, I sat on a commission, that was a real popular one, looking for new dump sites in the county. Yeah. But we did our due diligence, we mapped, we visited every potential site. And we were prohibited from using property in the coastal zone, so that meant that all of our potential sites were up the mountains and up, long, windy, steep roads usually. Our last visit was to Bonnie Doon, all of us packed in the county van. Well, on the way back down the mountain, the brakes gave out in the van. They started smoking and then failed. A very, very good public works driver got us back safely using the emergency handbrake, although some of us got out and walked as soon as we could. That adventure was enough for us to make a decision. There was no good, safe site that we could find. It wasn't about not in my backyard. It was about safety. Both careers that I've had, journalism and county government, are about public service. And public service, as I've said, is about relationships. Whether you are an engaged journalist, a citizen online journalist, or a county analyst. Good journalism and good local government are about real people and their stories, and both, I believe, are best heard by local ears. Cherish them. They are our democracy. Thank you. Questions, anybody? Nobody wants to know if I became a rodeo queen? I didn't, but I came close. Go ahead.
You still have the chance, Rob. Now that you're retired. With all the controversy now about fake news, how is this affecting young people that you see who might be interested in broadcast or print journalism?
It's a good question. I think that they still trust local because they are local. They're the hyper-local, I should say. I think young people and everybody are skeptical of the larger media. And we're very much funneled into these silos of news. We get our news from Rachel Maddow or Fox News, a type of thing. But when it comes to local news, we have a shared perspective, and I think still have a trust. And as I say, I don't see how it is even possible for fake news to infiltrate the local media. You're just too accountable to the people every single day. Oh, I'll tell you a great story. I was new at the Valley Press, or rather new at the Valley Press, and there was a big high school football game. And pretty soon, Bob Locatelli was this coach, and I got a call at the office that he had been killed in a hunting accident. And oh my gosh, he was from a prominent family, he was a lifelong resident, he was well known, well respected and liked. And so I started working on his obituary. And I, spread the rumor too, because I called people and said, well, Bob Locatelli has been killed in a hunting accident, and I'm working on his obituary. Well, I was just about ready to wrap up this obituary when I got a call from Bob Locatelli. It turned out that the coach on the field, Bob was at a hunting trip, and the assistant coach had decided to inspire the football players, one of those give it for the Gipper things, by telling them Bob had been killed. Well, of course, that just shot up the stands and right into the newspaper office, and it was all over town, which was another good lesson. Just because everybody knows it and everybody's heard it doesn't mean it's true. You have to check it out and be accountable. Bob was a good sport about it.
When you do local journalism, it seems like you'd be more susceptible to rumors. So my question is, when you worked at what was named, it was the Valley Press before, what years did you do that? And how did you just mentioned the same thing I was going to ask about.
Right.
How do rumors enter into
Rumors they fly. We call it the moccasin telegraph in Wyoming. But, it's just a small town. Well, like I say, news just shot up the stands and then all through the valley, and they do influence you. But that's the thing, you really, really have to check it out, because everybody knows it, everybody has heard it. The tendency is to believe it's true. And especially in small towns, you have to check that out.
Yeah. It's not fake news, but there's rumors.
But there's rumors that
What years did you work?
I started working at the Valley Press in 1977. It was right before Joe Kuchera was elected. And then, and I have lived in the Valley ever since. But I worked there on and off through the 80s. I left and became, when babies were born, I worked from home for the Mercury, and then, went back to the Valley Press as editor, and then bounced around, then went to the Sentinel in 91, and then 10 years later, went to county government.
Yeah, that agrees with my recall. I was just asking. I said you probably started in the late 70s and through the 80s.
Yeah.
I remember reading your pieces. They were quite good, actually.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. It was a real fun job. I mean, journalism is a ticket to meet whoever you want, and you meet the most interesting people. And especially in the Valley, there was never a shortage of good stories and good people to interview. It's just a wonderful place, full of characters, and the issues are just as important, and when you flesh them out, those are the issues that become policy. And they're just as complicated as any kind of big city issue can be. I mean, the Lompico Water District merger with the San Lorenzo Water District, am I right? Yeah. Yes?
Are there any topics that you would never write about, or that you shy away from writing about?
Divorces.
Let me ask specifically, how about suicide?
Suicides as well. Divorces and suicides. We do have the right to, and I have gotten bits of information from divorce filings. They are, when they go to court, they're recorded in their public information. However, I think that is a privacy violation.
Okay, so that would be specifically with the family or an individual, but the topic itself, and the importance of it as a public health issue, would that be something you would write about?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you for that distinction, because that's important. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Deborah.
Could you talk about the difference between investigative journalism and news reporting, and how that can affect local news, meaning the Sentinel and the Press Bank?
Yes, and they're the same. The investigative reporting is just good news reporting on a particular topic. I think at one point, before there was Bob Woodward and that whole investigative era, there was a era where papers were doing almost these social studies papers. They'd take a broad topic and do an investigative or deep look at it, not investigative per se. And I think the difference between the investigative and those social work papers were that the investigative reporting was based on a topic. It was based on deep details and looking at that sort of thing. Both of them come out of the field, though. Both of them start with people and those stories. They're not just a topic. If I answered your question. Thank you. Yes?
Kind of a follow-up question, and I don't direct this at local news, but do you see, or could you speak to any correlation between editorial comments and advertising influence or considerations?
It doesn't happen often, but when it happens, it happened to me in big ways. You know, like paper would lose a really big advertiser because I'd done something stupid. In general, there is a hard line between the editorial content and the advertising, and that was true even on my parents' newspaper, you know, and all the small ones. But I do recall when we started publishing in real estate, the asking price and the selling price of real estate, the realtors pulled out their advertising from the Sentinel in protest. It was, you know, and it wasn't an important, it was an important advertiser, but it wasn't, in my mind, a really big deal to print the difference between the asking and the final price, sales price, but it was in their mind. So I don't know, John, would you want to take a shot at that one? Does it happen?
No, because now it's always over the asking price, so no one's no one cares anymore. I'm serious.
Yeah.
I can't speak to it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't think it's a common thing, and as I said, in the chain ownership, I don't think that's a factor. I think the chains, you tend to have the same news printed in many newspapers, but it's not that the news reporters are being, or the editorial people are being told what to print and what to think, and how, you know. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about newspaper surviving. I mean, now I lived in San Jose, went to San Jose State. I got the NERC, and I still get it, just out of habit, and I don't get the Sentinel. But I've noticed how much smaller the paper has gotten over the
Right.
years. And I'm wondering if our newspapers just going to go out of business, or are local newspapers going to fill that slot?
I think they're transforming. I think local newspapers are going to fill that spot for a great deal. I don't think the larger newspapers are going to go away altogether. I think that they're going to be a combination of online and print journalism, much less of the print journalism. And the New York Times online edition is wonderful. You know, I think we still need it as much as we need the local news. I don't think they'll go away. Yes.
Hi, I'm Cherie Anderson. I'm the Director of Advertising at the Press Banner. I'm President of the Ambassador of the Chamber, and I work with Jeremy on the sales side of the Sentinel too. So just to address that, because this used to come up all the time. you physically see a newspaper, you don't physically see the number of readers that are reading online. I can tell you it was when I left, I've been the art director for 2 years, almost 2 years at the Press Banner. But when I was at the Sentinel the second time, back a couple of years ago, I believe it was 3.5 million views, unique views per month that the Sentinel had reading. Far more than the number of the printed copies. But people tangibly see this printed vehicle getting smaller, Sunday papers not as big, and quite frankly, the San Jose News has lost half of its circulation as well. But there's a huge digital engine behind both of those things. So just consider exactly what you're saying is to survive, to get younger people, and younger meaning pretty much anybody 40 and under, to read. You have to be digital, you have to have social media, and then you have the complementary part of the print, which is going to exist as long as people choose to read that way to one degree or another. So, just want to throw that out.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, to talk about that a little bit, I mean, my grandson's going to become Rio, and he doesn't read newspapers. He reads Reddit.
He reads what?
Reddit.
Oh,
And it's a compilation of all kinds of stories, and you can, be specific about an area of, what you want to, like geology is into that, and whatever it is. But most young people really are reading most of their news online, and they're not really looking at newspapers. And I think that they're a really important part of the vote. What's coming up locally, what's happening in our communities, what's happening nationwide. And I don't know if we're going to be able to serve them, with newspapers unless we have something online for them.
Agreed. You have to have something online. And I'll bet you they also are on Next Door Neighbors or those sort of sites that are almost like, the first layer of journalism. Newspapers. Yes.
I'm Pat Dwyer. I'm a reporter for the Press Banner.
Oh, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. And I want to try to focus my question on separating social media from journalism. I think we are swimming in a world where opinion and journalism are mixed to a degree, especially with like cable news and absence of the fair time doctrine for opposing views.
Right.
Since the FCC took that away, opinion and fact are a stew that we're all swimming through. And just to build the brand of journalism, I went to San Jose State in journalism. I respect the craft of journalism. I thank you for your remarks on the value of local journalism. But I'd like to build a brand that this is a trained journalist giving you this news, as opposed to a Facebook site where, and I respect citizen journalism, that's fine, but they're not trained journalists. And they mix opinion and fact all the time.
Right.
I would like readers to say, this guy or woman is trained to whittle through the opinion and put facts on page.
Right.
And that's just not, it's such a mix. And I'm just wondering how journalism can define itself as a profession as opposed to social media, who are grinding axes and spreading rumors and making the discourse really messy.
Yeah, well, I think you're doing a good job at the the Press Banner. And, as I say, journalists are the only people trained to look at local government, and in a nonpartisan way, and how local government works. And that's a really, really valuable thing. I think it's a valuable thing in our society and to democracy. And I think you do need to make that distinction.
I'm just not.
That's a good observation.
Because when I'm interviewing somebody, like, just go to my Facebook page, it's all there. And I go, well, is that your post on the Facebook page? No, it was somebody else, but it's very informative. And I go, I don't use Facebook as a source. It's, that's why I'm
Yeah. Well, you have a harder time sifting through, and verifying the truth. I mean, that's true. Reporters today, it would be much tougher than it was to make sure you're accurate. Yes.
Well, to follow up on that, can you talk about some of the tools and restrictions that a trained journalist must use, things about sourcing and identifying facts in a story and judgment calls, and that how the editors affect the words that are put down in print.
Yes. Trained journalists do have, and newspapers all have their own, and all media have their own policies on when to use anonymous sources, how many sources you have to have, usually 3, before you can use someone as an anonymous source. You have to have it from 3 different places. You verify, you fact check on everything. You have to have a balanced story, what we used to call talking heads, he said, she said, but it's balanced. You have to have both sides, at least both sides, if not many more sides of the story. You get slammed if you have a one-source story. That's not acceptable for a good journalist. What else? You don't use you use your judgments in what makes a story and where to step in on a story and what angle you take on a story. But you don't put your judgments in the story. You don't put your own conclusions and judgments in there. And I think that's another difference between Facebook. I could probably think of more. But yes?
I find online information very accessible, but mostly you go to what you're interested in. I find in print journalism, or to use the phrase from the Bush administration on a different subject, we don't know what we don't know. And looking at a newspaper, I see subjects that I would not investigate online.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You sound like a wonderful newspaper reader. So, anybody else? Felicity Fay had a question back there.
Well, let's give Robin
Well, thank
a big
you so
hand.
much.